sports mode, landscape mode, portrait mode. Every digital camera has automatic settings. But should you be using those, or should you be using one of the creative modes? In this video, I'm going to go through each of the creative modes and show you exactly what they mean and why you should be using them. So if you're stuck on automatic, now's the time to break free. Let's go. Today's digital cameras are designed to try to help you get the best shot possible, and for the most part they do a pretty good job of it. But when you're relying on the camera to make the decisions for you, you might not be getting the shot that you want, and you're definitely not going to be growing as a photographer. So my first piece of advice is never use automatic mode again. So let's dive into the creative modes, see what each of them does and why you want to be using them. Now, even in the creative modes, the camera is going to be trying to help you get the correct exposure all the time. Now remember, the two most important elements of exposure are shutter speed, which is how long your shutter stays open, and aperture, which is how wide the opening in your lens is and how much light is allowed through. So let's turn our command dial to the first setting, which is shutter priority, indicated by TV on the command dial. Now in shutter priority, you get to control the shutter speed. You can set it to whatever you want, between 1/5000th of a second all the way up to 30 seconds long. Whatever you want your shutter speed to be, you dial it in. And remember, your camera is still trying to help you get the correct exposure. So while you change your shutter speed, the camera is going to compensate for that by changing the aperture automatically. So let's take a look at the back of the camera. You can see here, as I change the shutter speed, the aperture is going to change automatically in order to try to get the correct exposure. Now, why do I want to control shutter speed? Well, in a lot of situations, shutter speed is going to determine the look of your photograph. For example, you might want to freeze motion. A fast-moving object, if shot with a fast shutter speed like 1/500th of a second or 1/1000th of a second, will freeze almost any motion. If you've got kids running around, you want to get a nice sharp shot of them, a nice fast shutter speed will capture that. If you're shooting sports and want to freeze the action, a nice fast shutter speed will do that. On the other end, a long shutter speed might give you the look that you want also. If you want to intentionally blur motion, someone dancing, something happening that you want to show the motion in, a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or 1/4 of a second might do that. If you want to shoot waterfalls and get that nice, beautiful, silky, flowing water effect, you're going to need shutter speeds of 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. And we'll get much deeper into controlling shutter speed in another video. Now let's turn our dial to my favorite setting, aperture priority, indicated by AV on the command dial. Now remember, aperture is the opening in your lens, which you can change to control how much light is allowed to pass through. The most important reason that you want to control your aperture is because aperture also controls the depth of field. A wider aperture, where the opening is larger, will result in a shallower depth of field. So an aperture of 2.0, 2.8, 4.0, the amount of your photograph that's in focus will be narrower. You want to use this for things like portraits, where you want to get a nice sharp shot of the person and blur the background. There's also a lot of other applications for it. A smaller aperture, indicated by a number like f11, f13, f16, is a smaller opening in your lens, will allow less light in, but your depth of field will be much deeper. So you can have a photograph where there's something immediately in front of your lens is in focus and something way off in the distance is also in sharp focus. This is great for landscapes. Now, just like with the shutter priority, when I change my aperture value, the camera is automatically going to compensate and change the shutter speed this time. So you can see on the back of the camera, as I change the aperture value, the shutter speed is going to automatically be changed to try to get me the correct exposure. We're going to dig way deeper into aperture in another video. So now we're going to switch from aperture priority to manual. Now manual is going to allow you to set the shutter speed and the aperture to whatever you want. Now while you're setting the shutter speed and aperture manually, the camera has nothing to compensate to try to give you the correct exposure. But it's still trying to help you out. Take a look at the back of the camera. I have my shutter speed and aperture dialed in, and the camera is telling me that my shot is overexposed by about a stop. And now as I change my shutter speed, you're going to see the camera is going to indicate that my exposure is just about correct now. It's always trying to help us out. Now, why would you want to shoot in manual mode? For me, the biggest reason to shoot manually is in changing lighting conditions. Remember, your camera is always looking at the entire scene and trying to expose based on the lighting conditions. If you have lighting conditions that are changing fairly rapidly, it could throw off the exposure and result in some shots that are too dark or too light. For example, maybe you're shooting a parade and the sun keeps going in and out of the clouds. You want to be able to expose your subjects correctly regardless of the bright or dark backgrounds. I use it most when I'm shooting live music. In conditions like that, you get your exposure in the beginning, and even if the lighting is changing, there are strobes, there are spotlights going on and off, none of that should matter. Your exposure should be the same throughout. There's one more important mode, and that's the bulb setting. In some cameras, the bulb mode is right on the command dial. In some, you have to access it through the shutter priority mode. When accessing it through the shutter priority mode, if you go past 30 seconds, it'll take you to the bulb setting. Now in the bulb setting, just like in manual, you're going to control the shutter speed and the aperture. But the shutter speed is not a preset number. You can make the shutter speed whatever you want as long as you're holding down that shutter button. And in order to hold down the button, you're going to need to use a cable release. So the shutter will remain open for as long as you're holding that button. Now this mode is incredibly useful when shooting fireworks, because some exposures are going to be 1 or 2 seconds long, some are going to be 10 seconds long, or 30 seconds long, or even longer. You want to be able to vary your exposure based on each sequence. This mode is also absolutely necessary if you're taking exposures longer than 30 seconds. So definitely get your camera out of automatic mode. It's so much better to mess up a shot and to learn from it than it is to always rely on your camera to do the work for you. If you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be digging deeper into things like shutter speeds, apertures, long exposures in our other videos. And as always, if you have anything you want to say to us or if you have any questions, definitely in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Well, I hope that helped you out a bit. We'll see you in the next video. Something just popped.